To be frank, Metal Gear Solid Delta is technically poor in a number of ways on every device out there, but on PC it can at least be better than what you have on console. On console, players are stuck with a variable frame rate no man's land, between 30 and 60, or with a 30 FPS mode that doesn't really work like it should. Konami and Virtuous appear to have made some poor decisions regarding graphical load, configuration, and perhaps an over-reliance on VRR that just doesn't pan out, especially on the PlayStation consoles. Even with that baggage in mind, the PC version of Metal Gear Solid Delta leaves the decision-making to the user. And as a result, with the right GPU, it can be a much better experience in the end. That is, in spite of some incredibly obvious faults that I will talk about in due course in this video. So today's PC focused video on Digital Foundry will talk about the good and bad of the PC version of Metal Gear Solid Delta, and how you can at least attempt to make it a better experience with some tweaking. Let's get right into it with some light praise where it is due. Metal Gear Solid Delta does do some key things right, at least in spite of its larger faults. It starts off with a semi-lengthy shader compilation step, which took only 4 minutes on a Ryzen 5 3600, and it seems to work quite well. Shader pre-compilation appears to be effective in the game's intro areas, though I cannot say for certain that that will be maintained across the entire length of this quite long game. Contrary to what I heard pre-release, the game does give you some control over graphical quality, although it is definitely lacking heavily in granularity and user readability. You only get 2 useful options here, and the rest are just kind of unimportant. The positive thing, though, is that they at least offer effective scaling for your GPU performance, but more on that later. Another positive aspect are the mouse controls, which I think actually feel pretty great, in spite of the warning in the game's intro about the game being designed around controllers. And lastly, and most importantly, I can say semi-definitively at least, that the hitching found across so many Unreal Engine 5 titles is not found here, at least for the game's first hours. Shader pre-compilation works well, as I just mentioned, and the game doesn't seem to have traversal stuttering at all, presumably due to the gameplay areas and how they are split up, mimicking the extremely small areas as found on the PS2. The game probably just doesn't instantiate actors on the fly like many other UE5 games, and as a result, the frame time graph will be steady here. Though when looking at that frame time graph, I want to stop the praise and start the critiques. Yep, the frame time graph here is maxing to 16.6 milliseconds with VSync off. That means the game is capped at 60 FPS. The positive of this cap is that cutscenes are at least unlocked up to 60 FPS on PC, but the negative is of course that the whole game is locked to 60. In an era when ultra high refresh monitors are a dime a dozen on PC, this doesn't make sense. For a modern PC release, it is very short-sighted. I strongly implore Konami here to invest some time into making the game work at arbitrary frame rates above 60. Another issue is that the game's various FPS locks are not technically good. For example, the 60 FPS max frame rate here at higher refresh rates like 120Hz will have improper frame pacing with staccato beats of 8.3 milliseconds interspersed with 25 millisecond ones and 16 millisecond ones. It averages to a flat 60 FPS over time, but it's not a flat 16.6 millisecond line as it should be. Same with the game's 30 FPS pre-rendered video sequences. They have frame pacing issues. Heck, even some sequences of pre-rendered video run at 40 FPS bizarrely, even on 60Hz screens. I have no idea what that's about. And you guessed it, they still run with improper frame pacing. Yes, VRR will help smooth out fluctuations here, which VSync fails with. But is it really hard to ask for at least the mandatory frame rate locks to have proper frame pacing? Alongside lacking high frame rate features, the game also lacks support for wider aspect ratios. So if you're on ultra wide with the base game, you're out of luck here. Many basic PC staples are absent here, and Metal Gear Delta on PC feels more like a port of a PS2 locked game than it does a modern release on a versatile engine. The biggest issue though comes from the GPU performance. Now, Tom's coverage of the PS5 Pro specifically sounded an alarm in my head. The GPU in that machine tends to fare all right in most titles, yet here, even with extremely modest internal resolutions, the PS5 Pro was giving questionable performance. Loading the game up on PC with an RTX 4060 gave me clear insight as to why the game performs so on console. The game is just extremely GPU limited. Even with just using the high settings with DLSS 3 quality mode at 1080p, the RTX 4060 could be dipping easily into the upper 40s at times during normal gameplay sequences, just in the prologue with not too much going on, honestly, in terms of action. That is 720p internally, only outputting at 1080p on a GPU that tends to perform much like the one in the base PS5. 720p internally, and still far away from a very stable 60 FPS. The game's biggest GPU burden appears to be the foliage density and the closeness of the camera to said foliage. This causes periodic dipping of the frame rate when you either get a face full of it or when you see a long spanning view full of that green stuff. Maybe this is because they're using an older version of the engine that has less efficient foliage rendering. It's hard to know, but it's definitely one of the big issues here. Another technical issue is low-end CPU performance. While not filled to the brim with traversal stutters, there still can be some scenes in this game which will challenge lower-end and older CPUs, and I presume they are challenges also for the console CPUs, given their age and characteristics. Many of the little gameplay arenas in the game are very light on the CPU, as it is a PS2 game after all, but some of the slightly larger gameplay areas did cause CPU limited frame rates, and these would dip into the 40s on the Ryzen 5 3600 when the AI in the area was activated and running around. In such a moment, the frame times also started to take on an unhealthy look on this CPU. This is definitely not the default way most of the gameplay areas in the game play, but this game definitely can still have its CPU hotspots, and I presume it will require a Zen 4 CPU or higher to hit a consistent 60 FPS in such areas. So this game does have CPU limits here that will lock out a number of consumers out of 60 FPS due to gameplay considerations. But let's say your CPU is good enough. How will you then make the game run better on your GPU? Here, there is little that can be done with the settings, as there are only two worthwhile performance adjustments. Here, the global illumination setting controls the quality of both software Lumen reflections and Lumen diffuse GI. At 1080p DLAA on an RTX 4060, reducing that GI setting down from ultra to high makes indirect lighting less stable and less locally accurate, and it makes the SDF reflections slightly blobbier. The win to performance though that it has is great, a 20% increase. Going down to medium further degrades indirect diffuse lighting for a 27% jump over ultra. Going down to low completely turns off Lumen as far as I can tell, and it presents a game that looks awful for a 37% performance increase over ultra. Here I recommend high for optimized settings like I do in pretty much every other UE5 game. Virtual shadow maps are much the same. Going from ultra to high leaves some shadow edges with more aliasing, but the average difference is so small on screen for a near 17% performance increase. The medium setting makes shadows at a range lose resolution noticeably for little performance gain, and low turns off all shadows, once again making the game look awful for a 33% performance win. Here I recommend high for optimized settings. Both of those settings combined yield a nice 37% average performance uplift in a scene like this one on a 4060 at 1080p DLAA, bringing the FPS to slightly above 40, but yeah, that is still a far cry from 60 FPS in these jungle scenes. The only other recourse you have is to start utilizing image reconstruction. Using DLSS 3 quality mode, for example, which the game supports, does not get us exactly to 60, but it is at least much closer and much more fluid looking in motion. This further increases performance by 29% over native resolution optimized settings. But that's really where you get to on a GPU like this. We are using optimized settings and image scaling, and we're still not hitting a consistent 60 FPS in all scenes. It is thankfully a fine VRR experience due to graceful GPU limited frame times, but it points out a significant thing for this game. It just was not designed around 60 FPS at higher resolutions on lower spec GPUs like this one, or like those found in the aging base consoles. PS5 Pro though, I think that performance should be much better if they were to dump PSSR and keep those resolution metrics much more like those of the base PS5 performance mode. With that in mind though, if you have a lower spec GPU like the 4060, you're going to have to live with image quality compromises here to attempt a closer lock to 60 FPS. Truly though, the game only starts to shine with better GPUs, one tier above this one, like the 4060 Ti or 4070. Dropping in a 4070, for example, with a CPU that can keep up with it, sees it holding to that 60 FPS line much better than the 4060 ever could at a higher res to boot. Optimized settings here with 1440p DLSS balance mode, with gameplay keeping to a very flat 60 FPS, minus when some transparency gets close to the screen. With a GPU of this caliber, there's also room to increase DLSS up to DLSS quality if you'd like, or more importantly, force the game to use DLSS 4, which has a considerable effect on the game's image quality, for the better. This game just seems to be built for GPUs of around this level or a tiny bit lower, where its inherently intense variability of load does not see the GPU teetering off the edge while doing basic gameplay, unlike what we saw on lower end GPUs. I have to admit though, as a reviewer, it is a bit strange to see a PS2 game at heart targeting such GPU levels, or how a game with PS2 enemy AI and level design can still manage to drop frames into the 40s on a 6-core CPU running at 4 GHz. But that is the way it is. Something behind the scenes here is making this game heavy. Unless they patch the game to change it completely, this is the way it's just going to be. So if you do have a good enough GPU and a strong enough CPU to avoid those heavier sections and their drops, then a consistent and stutter-free frame rate is actually not too hard to achieve in this game. And the game runs well enough with a base level of hardware. It's just a lot higher than we're used to. Though unfortunately, the game is lacking a lot of PC niceties it ought to have. And that is where mods come in. Already, so shortly after release, people are modding the game to make it better. Now, some of these mods, specifically those about performance, are probably snake oil, but I want to point out those that I think actually aid the experience. First, there's this tweak here listed on Reddit about changing the game to use hardware Lumen, and even DLSS ray reconstruction if you are on an NVIDIA GPU. Hardware Lumen here works well, and there are numerous benefits. The biggest is found on vegetation, which is now handled much more accurately in the lighting model. You get some really nice indirect shadows there underneath them, whereas the software Lumen can look a bit glowy and floaty typically. With ray reconstruction on, you can also see fewer artifacts in reflective surfaces. They will have crisper reflections with less ghosting, and the reflections you do see will be much more detailed thanks to hardware Lumen. This is most visible on water. The tweak for hardware ray tracing works surprisingly well. The only issue is performance. With all that vegetation, it is heavier, going from a locked 60 at native 4K DLAA on an RTX 5090 with software Lumen to around 45 FPS with the same roughness cutoff, and 43 with enhanced rough material tracing. So ray reconstruction here is heavy, but if your GPU is big enough, this seems like a pretty great visual win. The last mod I recommend is Lyall's MGS DeltaFix, and specifically if you're on an ultra-wide monitor. Here with the mod, the game works surprisingly flawlessly with a 21:9 resolution, which I tested. Menus seem in order, gameplay seems fine with the HUD mapping to the edges, and even cutscenes render well. Pre-rendered video files are of course still standard widescreen, but this entire experience on 21:9 is surprisingly native feeling. I'm really confused why the game did not have this and modders are adding it at day one. The thing that I do not recommend to use with Lyall's fix at the moment is the frame rate unlock above 60. It works, but as my colleague John tested, it can lead to soft locks, like here where John could not open a door with the FPS unlocked. In my opinion, I would hold off on FPS unlocking until such issues are remedied, as it could devastate your gameplay experience at times. And with that being said, that is the end of this video. MGS Delta on PC is not exactly a shining example of what I wish from PC versions. It lacks many standard features and does some absolutely bizarre and even bad things. The lack of good graphical options is specifically keenly felt. There's so little in here. Also felt is how heavy the game is generally on the GPU, and sometimes on the CPU. But if you have a system that can get past all that and is decently powerful and modern, the game actually runs rather alright, even if it is maxing out only at 60 FPS. In the end, the PC platform actually does have the best way to play the game here, and it does lack the stutters I've so come to despise, so I can only fault it so much really, as it gets those essential aspects right. Anyway, if you like this review, like, subscribe, ring the bell, help us out on Patreon. As always, this is Alex, bin you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.